The origin of all human beings is Africa. Yes, Africa is the homeland, the original homeland of all human beings. And maybe you've not heard that before, and you might want to take exception to that, and I understand that because that's not taught, that hasn't been taught, it's not widely known, but serious anthropologists and genetic scientists and paleontologists tell us unequivocally that this is the case. 200 years ago, Homo sapien existed in what is called the East Rift Valley, which is on the eastern coast of Africa, near modern-day Rwanda and Kenya. That is the origin of all of humanity, 200,000 years ago. That's where it all started for us. One way of looking at this is for the majority of our time on planet Earth as Homo sapiens has been spent or was spent on the continent of Africa. Homo sapiens, or modern humans, have their origins in the East Rift Valley, which is near modern-day Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda, around and near the lake that is the largest lake on the continent of Africa, Lake Victoria. And then what happened is that human beings began to migrate initially within the continent. There were two branches or paths of migration within the continent of Africa. The first path was southward down the eastern side or the eastern coast of Africa along the Indian River toward modern-day Zimbabwe and South Africa. But actually a simultaneous path was north and west toward modern-day Cameroon, Nigeria, and Niger. The story of human beings, and it's still the story today in the year 2024, is one of continuous migration, adaptation, modification to adjust to the environment, to the circumstances that may be more favorable in another location or hostile in your current location. Anthropologists refer to this as push and pull factors. Humans have migrated, they've moved to get away from something that was dangerous. That is referred to as a push factor. Or they have migrated to greener pastures, so to speak, literally at the beginning of humanity's epic, to be able to feed themselves and to shelter themselves. So initially there were two migratory patterns. We've talked about this. But then 60,000 years ago, there was another wave of Africans that left the base. And when I say the base, I'm speaking about the East Rift Valley, again, along Lake Victoria, near modern-day Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda. A second wave of migrants left the base about 60,000 years ago and began to migrate northward and eastward toward the Horn of Africa, toward what we know today as modern-day Ethiopia and Somalia. And about that same time, they worked their way to the edge of the Red Sea, and they crossed the Red Sea, and they went into Saudi Arabia. Now, that's important because sometimes when we talk about whether people are Black today, whether they are African today, some of our Northeastern brothers and sisters will sometimes say, no, I'm actually of Saudi Arabian origin or descendancy. The issue here, the reason why we're touching on this is because actually what we see is that the people that eventually or that initially became quote unquote Saudi Arabians were Africans that crossed the Red Sea roughly 60,000 years ago and went into Saudi Arabia, and they worked their way from Saudi Arabia to the Gulf, what is called the Persian Gulf, in and around and near today what is Iran and Iraq, and they continued to migrate eastward, eventually getting all the way to China and to Korea. But also at the same time, they migrated eastward and southward, arriving in India and then going southward toward Malaysia and Indonesia. Now, at that time, the islands that are south of India and Malaysia and Myanmar were connected. This was one continuous landmass. Eventually, around 35,000 years ago, those Africans reached what is modern day Australia. And we have evidence of that if we look at what are called the Aborigine people. We see that they have very strong Negroid features. In fact, if you look at all of the people along that initial pathway that started 60,000 years ago, going into Saudi Arabia, you see some very, very dark skin. The texture of the hair is different, and that is because they are moving away from the equator. And as human beings moved away from the equator, it was not necessary to have that curly, tight hair, which protected them from the heat of the sun, which was most intense. And further, as they moved away from the sun, they needed less melanin. And so their skin color began to change, and the hue of their skin became increasingly lighter. And as they moved into different environments, even the physical structure and the features of their face began to change. The length of the nose, the thickness of the lips, and all of that was done. The change, nature was adapting the human body to adjust and to fit it to the environment that it found itself in. But the migration continued when the human beings finally reached China. They made what would be considered a left turn and began to migrate back toward Russia and all of those Baltic states that we know today. And eventually, roughly 40,000 years ago, they reached places that we know today, such as Poland, Germany, ultimately France and Spain. But from that, we see that what we call, or the people that we call Europeans, are relatively newcomers on the world stage. They are starkly different in terms of their appearance than the original human beings because of the environment that they ended up in, which tended to be colder and more extreme, which required them to have less melanin so that they could receive the limited amount of sun that was available throughout the year. So the body was adapting. In one sense, and I don't mean that in a derogative or pejorative sense, but when you look at white skin relative to black skin, what you see is some type of biological mutation. And again, I mean that strictly as a definitive, descriptive term that is used in science. But the point is that we are all Africans. I say that because I find it striking that sometimes even people who are clearly black in terms of their skin color, who are clearly part of the African diaspora, whether they be in Jamaica or whether they be in Haiti, whether they be in the United States of America or Canada, they want to be anything but African. And in fact, I recall growing up and hearing some of these angry retorts where some of my playmates, some of my schoolmates would angrily say, "I'm not African. I wasn't born in Africa. My grandmother and my grandfather weren't born in Africa. We're not from Africa. We're from this country." Well, here's a newsflash. Yes, you're from Africa. Yes, all human beings are from Africa. Last thought that I have about this. I remember growing up in Southern California, Long Beach, Los Angeles area. And there was this hazing that went on. That whenever someone would move to the big city, from Mississippi or from Arkansas or from Texas, we would refer to them as country. In the 90s, a similar term was used to refer to people from southern rural cities. They called them Bama, and it wasn't used as a compliment. It was used to say that you were unrefined and unsophisticated, even though their roots were in the South, even though their grandmothers and their grandfathers and their great-grandparents were in the South, buried in that southern soil. And so it is with all of humanity. In the same way that we used to haze newcomers to the big city in Los Angeles, and I'm similar, and I'm told that the same happened in New York, in Chicago, and Detroit, and places like that as well. In the same way, humanity hazes and dismisses and condescends when it talks about Africa, rejects it. But Africa is all of our home, and that makes us all family. Welcome to the family.